farmers from around the country converged on Parliament House in Canberra tonight to vent over the government's anti-farming agenda. I noticed the ABC this afternoon was saying, there were hundreds there. Well, from what I could see, I think it was more accurate to say thousands. The green evangelism, though, Mark, it's pushed by Labor, it's pushed by Chris Bowen. This is at the heart of what they're feeling in the bush, isn't it, really?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, farmers can't all gather in Canberra today. They've got farms to run, and it's getting tougher under this government because of the false belief that Australia, with 1.3% of global carbon emissions, can somehow save the planet. And the two sectors that the Albanese and state Labor governments pick on are the mining sectors and the agricultural sector. Well, they're our competitive strengths. You know, what sort of sabotage is this, that a country which can't save the planet from climate change actually starts to diminish its economic competitive advantages in mining and farming? So it's no surprise the farmers are upset. Just about every environmental and other decision, banning live sheep export trade and so forth by the Albanese government is against the interests of the farmers. They even try to joke about it. Well, it's no joke. They're doing it tough, and it's no wonder that they're protesting today in Canberra in large numbers.
Is the problem with Labor, do you think, Mark, the fact that there aren't any, ALP MPs, probably none in Cabinet, that really has had any part of their life connected to rural Australia?
Yeah, if you're in the Labor caucus and you know anything about farming, you once visited a farm or you lived on a farm for a couple of months, you will end up being the spokesperson and the Minister for Agriculture. So you haven't got MPs who represent farm-based electorates. You haven't got MPs who've had direct agricultural experience, and that shows in the performance of the government. So there's a lack of knowledge, a lack of sympathy because of the climate change fanaticism.
Yep.
And they probably look at this, they're mainly in Liberal and National Party electorates. Why does it matter to us? Well, that matters to the country big time because it's the backbone, one of the backbones of our economic growth.
Yeah, spot on. Natalia, we learnt from those huge farming protests in Europe earlier this year that farming power does work. It changes policy, doesn't it?
Well, farming produces all our food and so meat and vegetables. So if you stop producing, we'll all starve to death. But most importantly, we are lucky in Australia that we have such a rich and prosperous farming. We export beef. Even when growing up in Russia, we had the kangaroo meat in our sausages. So Australian meat goes everywhere. It's the seventh export after mining and gold and education. And it's just silly to shoot ourselves in the foot. But also to the point about Labor government having no idea about the life cycle and the production process in farming, there are reports that it actually creates more animal cruelty that they banning the live export of livestock, because just think about it, if those sheep and lamb cannot be exported live, then they need to be cut here, and there is only so many arbitrage that can make it happen.
Yeah.
So those animals just hang there, and the farmers don't have any money to feed them, so they will just starve to death. So how is animal cruelty?
Yeah, well, more than that, you've got other countries that will fill the void and send live animals to the places where we would normally send them, and do so in a very a cruel fashion because they don't have the level of standards that we run by. Now, an executive with the Minerals Council, Mark, has sliced and diced the federal government over their IR laws. Tanya Constable said they were a recipe for conflict. These changes are purely a reward for the generous election donations from the union movement, aren't they?
Well, in large part, that's true. Also, the union affiliations to the Labor Party, the fact that the Labor Ministry and the caucus is full of former trade union officials. So, yeah, it's a trade union party, but that's not helping the Australian economy. Unions now in the private sector are well less than 10% of workplace coverage. So they've become less relevant. And Chris, this is a very good point that's been raised today, because we do need productivity reform in Australia, and we need greater labour market flexibility. And the Albanese government's gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to go back a long way, probably to the early 80s and even the Whitlam government, to see a time like this in Australia where economic growth is so sluggish, basically a per capita recession, but inflation is judged to be too high. Now, the only answer to that is to lift productivity, and a bunch of things need to be done, including labour market flexibility, including doing something about the number of people who are long-term unemployed in Australia, the work-at-home agenda and so forth. There's lots of things post-COVID that need to be done, and Albanese won't do them because of the power of the trade union movement inside his own party.
Yeah, you're right about labour force flexibility, not restriction. These IR laws are notoriously restrictive. Natalia, these are measures best suited to the 60s, aren't they?
Absolutely. And that's the era I was thinking about. You're spot on. I was watching a Netflix period series that, it's actually happening in the 60s in London. And that's where Albanese's reforms would have been very well suited when workers, they were 16-hour shifts at the factories. They had no other choice to work elsewhere. When there's no power on the workers, where there were huge capitalists who were owning all the factories and buildings. It's not like that now, especially in the mining. And to the workplace flexibility, more than half of the employment in Australia falls under non-standard work arrangements. And I don't know why we're ignoring that. So those AI laws, they are suited for 9-to-5 workers who are vulnerable and unskilled. Miners are not unskilled, neither vulnerable workers. And they are, many of them, doing shift work, and they would be very happy with flexibility. And I'm sure they will be happy to pick up an extra shift if their employer contacts them after hours.
I'm sure. I'm sure they would. And this is what they are no longer able to do under these new laws. Now, the Federal Treasurer, I mentioned at length last night about the Treasurer using the Reserve Bank to deflect away from what is the government's creation when it comes to a bad economy and an inflated economy. The Treasurer is really after the Reserve Bank. Jim Chalmers wants veto power over the RBA, and the Greens are backing those reforms. What happened to having an independent central bank, Mark?
Well, it was established in the 1990s, and it was one of the factors helping Australia with world record period of sustained economic growth. So the independence of the Reserve Bank has served Australia well. You know, Jim Chalmers, with this conflict now, blaming the Reserve Bank for his own inflation issues because of the budget deficit and debt. Chalmers is way too late on this. I mean, the time to be critical of the Reserve Bank was 2 years ago, when blind Freddie could see, coming out of COVID because of the labour market shortages and the supply chain blockages, inflation around the world, not just Australia, inflation around the world was on the rise, and the Reserve Bank, if they'd lifted interest rates then, could have had fewer interest rate rises, but earlier, to nip inflation in the bud. Instead, we've now got a situation where globally, inflation is coming down, but in Australia, it remains above the Reserve Bank target band of 2 to 3%. So Chalmers, if he wanted to be critical of the Reserve Bank, he missed the boat. It was 2 years ago you needed to say these things. Now, in the shadow of a looming federal election campaign, he's trying to put the blame on the Reserve Bank. He probably doesn't like, Chris, the fact that the Reserve Bank governor told the truth.
Yes.
That the real inflation issue that's stopping the Reserve Bank bringing down interest rates at the very high levels of federal and state Labor government deficits. So she spoke the truth, and now Chalmers, somewhat childishly, is retaliating.
I think that's exactly the case. Now, Natalia, we should be thankful the RBA operates separate from government, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. And that system where Reserve Bank is independent from the government and the parliament is worldwide accepted practice. And where Reserve Bank is not independent from the government, one example is China. But let's get down to the basics and why Reserve Bank should be independent from the government. And it's very simple. because the fiscal policy cycle of the parliament is dependent on the election cycle. And it's not my opinion. It's a textbook first year statement. When you study economics in your first semester, every student knows that who passed economics. So basically what happens, the closer you are to the elections, the more likely fiscal policy is expansionary, meaning the more money they chuck into the economy, whether it's needed or not, because the aim of the politicians at the end of the day is to be re-elected. Otherwise, they won't be able to continue any of the policies that they originally planned for. So the independence of Reserve Bank balances out this inherent flaw of the democratic cycle of 4-year, 3-year parliament. And yes, we are lucky that we had this perfectly working system that provides all the necessary checks and balances so that the policy is going in the right direction and is not going up or down depending on how close we are to the elections. And as I said, again, what are they trying to do? They want us to be like China, where the dictator tells the Reserve Bank what to do. I do not think it's a good idea.
Yeah, well, they're doing the same kind, or taking the same kind of approach in so many other areas, including disinformation and misinformation. Finally, from the United States, Melania Trump has entered the US presidential campaign by releasing a short second video. Let's have a look at it.
The 2020 election results changed our lives forever. It impacted our quality of life, cost of food, gasoline, safety, and even the geopolitical landscape. America is more divided today than ever before. It has become increasingly apparent that there are significant challenges to free speech, as demonstrated by the efforts to silence my husband.
Mark, is Melania an electoral plus for Donald?
Yeah, I think so. She obviously brings out the human side of Donald Trump, not just the political head kicker. So I think that she's an asset, and it's interesting that in promoting her forthcoming book, a memoir, they've got this video out there, and I'd imagine the Trump campaign team would want Melania Trump to be increasingly involved in the showdown for the election in November up against Kamala Harris. Obviously, the woman's vote is a factor, and Mrs. Trump is an asset in that regard. But, you know, it's an interesting situation where I'm starting to think the election contest, Chris, is a good Donald Trump versus bad Donald Trump. Because if he sticks to the policy agenda about cost of living and the border crisis in the United States, then he'll win. But the personal attacks and that head-kicking side, the bad Trump, is what drags him down. So Melania Trump is offsetting factor there, and can only be good for his campaign and his polling numbers. Yeah,
you're right. You should be sending them that advice. Now, Natalia, are you a fan of Melania Trump?
I'm wondering if I sound same as her.
A little bit.
Okay, I have no hope of getting rid of that accent by the sound of it. But look, Melania is in a way a dream come true for every Eastern European girl. But on a serious note, there is nothing in that ads about her, so do not expect a Meghan Markle and Harry style memoir. I do think the fact that it's really brief and vague, they're trying to build all this hype and anticipation and draw attention to them. Similarly, how Trump stolen the show from Joe Biden inauguration when he said, "I'll be back," and just walked up the aisle into his private jet. So they're just trying to do the same little show there. And again, in that 30-second video, Melania doesn't talk much about herself, and she's never been much vocal about her personally. We know briefly about her biography, but nothing about herself as a person. So I do expect that to be part of the Trump's election campaign rather than her personal memoir or, again, any sort of bestseller book.